Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Triunfo, otherwise known as Bally Alley on the Atari Age forums. And I'm here with...
Chris, otherwise known as Chris.
And you're listening to the 0th episode of the Bally Alley Astrocast. See, I barely know the name of it yet.
I think me and Adam believe that we thought up the name Astrocast ourselves. And we came to find out that there had already been one. It just hadn't been started. And I guess it was Rick and Willie. I think it was only those two.
Yep.
And it kind of sat there for a year. And hopefully they will be contributing to Adam's podcast here.
And I don't think of this as, quote, Adam's podcast. And I just used finger quotes. Sorry about that. But this is our podcast. Chris and I are recording this right now. Also, Paul Thacker, who is a regular of the Bally Alley Yahoo group, which we can talk about at a greater time or later time. We're hopefully going to do this together at some point. I wanted to sound natural as possible for this podcast, so I'm trying not to read anything off a piece of paper. I don't like my voice, and the fact that I'm letting you hear it means that I love you guys.
It's a great level of trust he's exhibiting, you guys. Yeah, and plus, I would immediately take a script away from him if he had one, because
thanks, Chris.
Yeah, extemporaneous is more fun to do, and I think it's more fun to listen to.
So, in saying that, we do have some notes we want to talk about. For this episode, we want to basically go over what we want to cover, which is what people seem to do in these episodes, saying, hey, there's going to be a podcast called this. And that's what we're doing here. So here's what we're doing in our podcast number 0.
That was always funny to me, like oxymoron, like episode number 0.
Right.
Let's go -1. Let's be rebels.
You may or may not know what a Bally Arcade or an Astrocade is. It's a console that was developed in about 1977. It was released in 1977. The first units were not actually shipped for various reasons until January of 1978. And very few people got them. They were first released by catalog only, a company called JS&A. Those systems had overheating problems. Most of them were returned, or many of them were returned. JS&A only sold approximately 5,000 units, so it says on the internet. I don't know where that number is quoted from. I've never been able to find a source. Bally eventually started selling them through Montgomery Ward. Now, Bally also had something called the Z-Grass that it wanted to release. This was going to be expanding the unit into a full-fledged computer. This never was released. This Bally system itself did not come with BASIC, but it was available nearly from the start. Many people used it. A newsletter formed around it called the Arcadian. The system has 4K of RAM, and it does not use sprites, but it can move objects just as well as the Atari and other systems of its time period. It could show 256 separate colors, and through tricks in machine language, it can show all of them on the screen at once, but not normally in a game, although there are a few screens that did it, but not actively during a game. The system is fun to play if you can find one that works. If you don't already have one, you're going to discover, if you go searching for one, they're not inexpensive. They are becoming pricey on the internet. Because of the overheating problems they had since the beginning with the data chip, you will find that if you own one now, you're getting a unit that, quote, has not been tested, which means, of course, it is broken. If you find one on the internet that says not tested, please do not buy it. Just let it stay there and let someone else buy it. And when they get it and it doesn't work, if they're surprised, then they did not read the Bally Astrocade FAQ. We'll go into much greater depth about this system in the next episode. I just wanted to let you know that's the system we'll be talking about. It has a 24-key number pad. It has a controller that is it unique? Well, I think it's unique. Mm-hmm. It has a paddle built into the top knob. It's a knob, it's called. And it has a 8-directional joystick. It's built like a gun controller style pistol. It's called a pistol grip. And it's sort of shaped like one if you picture a classic arcade-style gun and then just cut off the barrel. That's basically what you have. Something that was originally mentioned, and I think Bally might have called it that for 2 years, are videocades. Videocades are the cartridges. These were actually also referred to as cassettes. These are not tapes. These are about the size of a tape, but they're ROM cartridges. In the beginning, they held 2K, and later on, they held 4K for Bally. Astrovision, or Astrocade Inc., later released some 8K games in about 1982. Those are usually considered the best games on the system because they had more ROM to spare and to put more features into the games. Now, BASIC was available from about the third or fourth month after the system was released to the public. It was originally called Bally Basic. It did not come with a tape interface, but one was available for it. Bally Basic cost approximately $50. The tape interface, which could allow the user to record at 300 baud, which is pretty slow. To fill the 1.8K of RAM, which is available to BASIC, would take about 4 minutes to load a complete program. Better than retyping it every time, isn't it? But it's not a great speed. Later on, this system, when it was re-released, it actually came with BASIC, and it was still called Bally Basic, but today, to differentiate it from the original BASIC cartridge, most people call it Astrocade Basic or Astro Basic. And the reason for this is the later BASIC has a tape interface built into the cartridge itself. This can record and play back information at 2000 baud, which is an odd number because it's not a multiple of 300, because when 300 baud tapes were speeded up and by a newer format later, they were 1800 baud, but tapes were available, which meant the user community was able to grow because they could share programs. It was sometimes a problem for them because I could record a program on my tape drive and I could send it to you in the mail and you'd say, it's not loading. Well, you'd sometimes have to adjust your read and write heads to match it. Imagine having to do that today. I wouldn't want to think about doing it. So even if you can believe it, with that kind of an issue, with users having to adjust their tape systems in order to load programs sometimes, there were commercially released tapes. These have been archived and are available, and you can download them from BallyAlley.com.
So the play and record head on anybody's tape recorder, there was a possibility that it had to be adjusted to play a tape his buddy had sent him because he had a tape recorder with differently aligned play and record heads in it. I mean, that's something else. Now,
the recorders that were normally used were called shoebox recorders. These were recommended. If you tried to record to a home stereo, maybe Chris can understand this better and tell me more about it in a later episode, but you really couldn't record to one and then get that information back. I'm not sure why. But the lower quality that was available from the low-end tapes that were less expensive were actually better. Just like there were better audio tapes available, which you should not have used for data because I don't know why. So, ideal podcast length. In my mind, I see about an hour and a half. While I listen to many podcasts, among them in television areas and others, that are not short, and as has been discussed in television areas, there's a pause button. So if somehow we do end up at 5 hours, please understand that there is a pause button. If we end up less, you don't need to use the pause button. Isn't that great technology, right?
Well, a very good idea that you had was obviously to conduct interviews with some, Bally game writers, people who are really knowledgeable about it.
There's quite a few people I'd like to interview. If we can find people from the 70s and the 80s, and even now, there's some people who've written some modern games and at least written some programs for the system.
Well, it would help if they're still around, yeah. Something
that's interesting I want to use is there's actually recorded interviews that we have from the early 80s and late 70s, phone conversations that Bob Fabris did from the Arcadian publisher. There was a newsletter called The Arcadian, and it published for 7 years, from 1978 to 1984, 85, depending on how you view things a bit. And he recorded some conversations with some of the more prominent people at the time. We've made WAV files of those, or FLAC files, and they are available for download, or many of them are already from Bally Alley. But it might be interesting to take out snippets from some of those and put them in the show. I hadn't thought of that before, but that's why we're going over this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's really cool. We say Bally Astrocade like we say Atari 2600, but it was never actually called the Astrocade when Bally owned it.
Not when Bally owned it, no. But after it was resold, they had the right to use the name Bally for 1 year. And Astrovision did do that. So for a short time, for 1 year, it was known as the Bally Astrocade. And it actually was called that.
Oh,
but
okay.
somehow that name has stuck, and that is what the name is called. And many people think it was called that from the beginning, which it was originally released under a few different names, which we'll get into at a later date. I like to think of it as the Bally Arcade / Astrocade.
Yeah.
It depends on how you look at it. Sometimes I go with either. Sometimes I go with both. Sometimes I call it the Bally Library Computer. It just depends how I'm feeling at the time. So we also don't plan to pre-write episodes. You might have noticed that by now. We do have a list that we're going by, and we do want to use notes, but reading from a script is not what I want to do. I don't want to sound dry and humorless. I like to have Chris here making fun of me. Well, maybe not making fun of me, but, Chris here helping me along to give me moral support. And I enjoy that I'll be doing this with him, and hopefully Paul as well.
It is strange for you and I to sit around talking about old video games.
Oh, isn't it? Isn't it, though?
Some of the sections that Adam has come up with are really interesting. They sound like a lot of fun, and what's cool is that they are necessarily unique to a podcast about the Bally console. For instance, we were talking about the Arcadian newsletter, and there's going to be a segment. It will probably be every episode because there's a lot of source material. This segment will delve into Arcadian notes and letters that did not make it into the published newsletter. And it's kind of a time capsule. In some ways, it will be fascinating, even for people who don't know a lot about the Bally Astrocade, because what you're getting is correspondence from the 70s and 80s, before anybody really knew what was going to happen with the 8-bit era,
There's material in the archives, because all of this material is from Bob Febris, and he was the editor of the Arcadian, and two people, Paul Thacker and I, we bought that collection from an individual who had bought it in the early 2000s, directly from Bob. And it was never broken up, so it's all together in about 8 boxes, large boxes, all in different folders. Bob Febris kept a really, really detailed collection and in great order. And he kept it in that shape from 1978 until about 2001 or 2002 when he sold it.
Wow.
So the fact that it survived and then someone else bought it and didn't want to break it up and sell it, it's pretty amazing to me. Mm-hmm. And we were able to pool our funds together, Paul and I, and purchase it. And all of it's been scanned, not all of it's available. Oh, and by the way, Bally Alley, in case there's some listeners who don't know, Bally Alley is a website that I put together, and it's mostly from the archives of the Arcadian, but there's a lot of interesting material there. And if you're interested in the Bally Arcade, you should check it out. It's ballyalley.com.
Adam is being kind of modest. He's done a lot of work on this. You're going to find archived materials that will make your eyeballs pop out of your head. And he's...
If you saw Chris, you'd know that's true.
Yes, absolutely. I'm recording blind. And, he's very picky about high-quality scans, as high as possible only. He's very meticulous about it, and I definitely recommend that you guys visit Bally Alley, .com. I know it's a lost battle. Humor me. They're not dots. All right, anyway.
All right, cartridge reviews. The Bally Arcade, it has a lot of perks. One of them is not its huge library of games. I take that back. It has a huge library of games. Many of them, as some people may not even know who are listening to this, were released on tapes. But the vast majority of games that people would think of as the console games are cartridges. The Bally could see, quote, 8K at once. It didn't have to bank switch or anything like that in order to do that. There was never a bank switching cartridge that was released for the Bally, at least at that time. Since the library is so small, I'm not sure if we're going to be covering a game per episode, or since we plan to cover all of the games, and there's certainly less than 50 if you include prototypes, and some of them are not games. Some of them were biorhythm, so that you could know when would be a good time to get it on with your wife to have a baby. So if that's what you want to talk about and listen to, write us and say, that sounds great. I want you to tell me when I can get my wife pregnant. The other day, my wife was taking a look at a game I was playing for a competing console, the Atari 8-bit game system.
They were going to say the Arcadia.
No, not the Arcadia. And I was playing a Super Breakout clone. She took a look at it and didn't know what it was. And I said, oh, it's a Breakout clone. She's like, I don't know what that is. I said, no, look at the game for a minute. It looks like Breakout. And she still didn't get it. And I said, okay, so you're going to have a ball that bounces off a paddle and it's going to hit the bricks up above. And she goes, I've never seen this before. And I said, okay, you've heard of Pong, right? She's like, well, yes, I've heard of Pong. I said, it's that.
It's that, except better. Between you and all the people you're in contact with from the Bally era and people like Paul, people who actually wrote games back then, information about how the console works and its languages and stuff, is that pretty much taken care of, or are there more mysteries to be solved?
There's some mysteries. Well, the neat thing about this system was even in the Arcadian, the early issues, you could get access for like $30 to the photocopies that were used at Nutting Associates. These are the people who actually designed the Bally system for Bally, and they did arcade games. We'll go more into that in another episode. But this information was available to subscribers right, almost from the get-go. So if you wanted to have a source listing of the AK-ROM, you could get it. And of course it came with a do not replicate on every single page, but you were allowed to get it. You could purchase it. It was freely available, and it was encouraged for users to use this information to learn about the system.
The reason I ask is that I'm wondering what the next step is. Whenever I think of this console, do people refer to it as a console or a computer, by and large?
A game system in my eye. I mean, it's a console. I mean, people don't think of it as a computer. No.
I'll start over. Whenever I think about this system, what usually comes to mind is the fact that it is unexploited, and that is perhaps not quite an elephant in the room, but that is the only real disappointment about the Astrocade, is that there are these amazing, vivid, brilliant games. I mean, the arcade conversions on the Astrocade are, for all intents and purposes, arcade perfect. This was a superior machine, and yet players were teased with a handful of astonishing games, and then that was it. And so, what could have been comes to mind for me a lot. And the phrase, tragically untapped. And what I'm wondering is why nobody has brought up the initiative of making new games. The last two were arcade conversions. They were not original, but they are, of course, phenomenal. I mean, two of the best titles, were War, which is a conversion of Warlords, and, of course, Crazy Climber. And you were in charge of all the packaging and EEPROM burning for those.
So I'm not saying... Partially. Okay. For all of... one of them I was. The other one was handled by a man named Ken Lowe. I came up with the package design and stuff like that and made a lot to make it happen, but I didn't program the games, no.
Right, but I mean, somebody else did the coding, but didn't you have all the cartridge shells and you were burning?
I made sure it all happened.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't do all the work, though.
Okay.
I mean, it helped that I was there, put it that way.
Right, we're talking about Crazy Climber mainly, right? Because you helped with War as well.
I did both, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And you wrote some of the back of the box copy.
I did all of that, yeah.
As expensive and limited as such a run would be, that's not really quite what I'm talking about, is having to go through all that to give people physical boxed copies. I guess another reason why people might not have written any more Astrocade games is that the relatively few surviving consoles could be prone to overheating themselves to death at any time. But then there's emulation, and right. Mess is all that we have, and it's not perfect. So wouldn't that be the first step for somebody to write a really good Astrocade emulator? I would do it if I knew how.
Yes. If there's one of you out there who's like, who couldn't write an Astrocade emulator?
Yes.
Please, would you do me a favor and send that to me tomorrow?
It's time. Tomorrow.
And something I want to get at is that Mess does work for most games. There are a few that don't work. Some of them used to work and now they're broken. Mess was updated to make it, quote, better, and now some games don't work. So I don't understand why that happened. The biggest drawback to Mess is it doesn't support the tape. It supports BASIC, but you can't save or load programs. And since there's hundreds And there's probably over 500 programs available, and there's many of those have already been archived and put on ballyalley.com, so you can try them out on a real system, but not under emulation. And it's quite easy to use under real hardware. We'll get into that another time, too.
In terms of cartridge reviews, and I'm only going to say this once. Thanks, by the way, for saying this is our podcast. I thought I was just being a guest.
No.
Oh, okay.
You're just a gas.
I'm just a guest. So should I help you pay for the Libsyn?
I think we'll be okay.
All right.
All our users are going to send donations every month.
Oh, that's right.
Just kidding there, guys.
So I'm just going to say this once and you're welcome. Review is a word I have a problem with when it comes to my own, stuff I write, but now apparently stuff I talk about, because I associate the word review with critics. And I think I was telling you the other day, Adam, I would never hit such a low level of self-loathing that I would ever call myself a critic. Talk about useless bunch. But so I don't know. For me, there'll be overviews. It's very picky, very subjective, has nothing to do with anybody else. You want to consider your stuff reviews. Totally respect that. But I don't do reviews. So either that or I'm in some sort of really intense denial. But personal reflections on games. Reviews leaves out... When you call something a review, it leaves out the fact that taste is subjective. It's a personal thing. I can't review food for you and have you think, oh, now I like that food I used to hate. And one's taste in games, music, etc. is just as personal. So Adam was saying that there are so few of them that we're not going to cover a game every episode. So what we're going to do is alternate so that you don't go completely without game content. Isn't that a buzzword, a frequent word online now? Content?
That is. Yeah.
Everybody wants content. I got a table of contents for you. We're going to alternate actual commercial cartridge games with commercially available tape games and even type-in programs, because there were a lot of good ones.
Most of them were written in BASIC.
Which is just awesome to me.
Yeah. We
were thinking of alternating the game stuff I was just talking about with this.
The Astrocade system, the Bally Arcade system as it was originally designed, for home use, it had two versions. There was an arcade version, which came out in 1978 with the first game, Seawolf 2, in the arcades. And there was the version that was released for the home. And it had 4K of RAM, while the version in the arcades had 16K and some additional support. But they used the same hardware, like the data chips. And they're so similar, in fact, that many of the system's games were brought home as cartridges. They don't use the same code. You can't run code for the arcade and vice versa. You can, for instance, take a Gorf and run Gorf on Wizard of War hardware. It'll look the wrong direction, but you can do that. The systems are very similar in that respect, but you can actually take an Astrocade, and it has been done before, that is a 4K unit, and actually do some fiddling with it, change the ROM a bit, give it more RAM. It's more than you have to do. There's actually an article about it that was written in depth. It's available on Bally Alley, the website. And you can make it into an arcade unit. Wouldn't be able to play the arcade games, but it would have access to 16K of RAM and that sort of thing.
Because when you say Seawolf 2, you mean the arcade game was running this hardware you're talking about.
Right.
Much of which was also in the console.
Yes.
Okay. And that goes for Wizard of War, Gorf, Space Zap. Well, that explains why there's so many arcade perfect home versions.
Right. They don't share the same code, but they are very similar. The high-res machine could display in what was considered then a high resolution. The Bally can only display in 1/4 of that resolution. I think perhaps we'll have the first episode cover specifically the hardware of the Astrocade.
So you were saying that this segment would cover the arcade games that used the Astrocade hardware, and I find that really, really interesting, because I never knew that. I thought they were just, very similar, and some of the same people created the home versions, but I never realized they were so close.
So another segment we plan to do is called What the Heck? It's going to be maybe focused on unusual hardware and maybe even released items, but something that, while it was released through the Arcadian newsletter or perhaps the Cursor newsletter, and even maybe one of the other small newsletters that was around for a short time for this system exclusively, when we're talking about a released product here, we're probably talking in the 10s, the 20s. I mean, new homebrew games get a wider release than games that are considered released back then. Maybe not the games, but hardware peripherals. There was something called the computer ear, which could do voice recognition, sort of. But the software for that isn't available, I don't think. Maybe it is. But I have the hardware, I've never tried running it before.
We're also going to, I say we, even though Adam's knowledge about, well, pretty much all this stuff is much greater than mine, hoping to cover the Z-Grass keyboard/computer. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, it's what you'd read on the internet about it, and if you can call that true, then that's what it is.
Right, and not just on the wiki rumor page.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual system, and it's worth learning about. So you don't hear about any of this stuff anywhere else, and that's what's really cool about this podcast. Everything you've got archived, everything you've learned, you never read about it back then, you know.
It was available to read about, but not in like the normal sources that people read about, like the Astrocade, which would have been Electronic Games and some of the other computing magazines at the time. But they didn't talk about, I mean, it was mentioned briefly, but only as a product that was supposed to come out. But in a way, Z-Grass did come out. The product, the language, Z-Grass, was available. There was a hardware system, a computer, which could cost upward of $10,000, that used some of the custom chips that were available in the Astrocade. And it was called the UV1. I'll get more into that when I cover the Z-Grass system in some future episode, which is why we're talking about it here. I would like to discover more about it. I want to learn. I don't think I can use it because it's not been archived. But the documentation's available on Bally Alley. I have that. Maybe I'll go through that a little bit. It was something to learn about.
Yeah, really cool.
Share.
Awesome.
It's all about sharing, man, and caring. Okay, the Bally Arcade and Astrocade history. History of the month we're going to have. It's going to start with the Arcadians #1, which was the first available newsletter. The Arcadians was a newsletter that published for just 4 issues. And it was published, and it was only 2 pages. The first one, I think, was only front and back. And then I think maybe the next one was 4 pages. But that was only 2 pages, front and back. It was really just a round-robin letter. It predates the Arcadian. It was only available to a few people. These have been archived. You can read them online. And I'm going to start there. As soon as BASIC was released, it took a few months after the Astrocade came out, before the Bally Arcade came out. And once that system came out, and with Bally BASIC, which required a separate BASIC interface so you could record to tape, then Bob Fabris, the editor, said, "We've got something we can explore together. Let's do this. Let's pool our resources and come up with a way to share information." That was what they were all about. And they did this very early on. That's something that interests me greatly about the system, and I want to be able to share that and compare it with knowledge of other systems that were out at the time.
That's really cool. I mean, it's one of the earliest systems of any kind that I know of that actually did have a community, that we're really trying to goad each other into doing new things and write programs and stuff like that. I mean, I can't imagine there was like an Altair community. I'm trying to date it.
There was an Altair community.
Oh, well, but they were all very rich. And they had a lot of time on their hands.
With those switches, right?
I hope you're going to do a What's New on Bally Alley. I know I keep going on about this, but that is just an amazing website to me. And so, you do a lot of updates to it. So when you do add new things to the Bally Alley website, and who knows, maybe this will give you a reason to add more things to the website.
It could. The website isn't updated very frequently. I have great intentions, everyone. So if you've been wanting to see updates, give me some motivation to do some. And I don't mean send me money. We, as the two of us and other people on the Yahoo group, we do like to BS about the system. But there's so much information in my archives, and there's only a few people who share it with me. It's basically 2 other people. We're thinking about putting it up on archive.org, but some of it is kind of, I think it might remain hidden from viewers, even though it might be archived there, because it's personal letters that I think probably shouldn't be shared, because it's personal information there. I mean, when I got the collection, there was actually like checks still that were uncashed in it that were written in the 70s. And I was like, those kind of things I did not scan because I was like, what? That's very strange to me. But I have, there's uncanceled, unused checks out there in some boxes. There were people subscribing to the newsletter, and I'm not sure why he didn't cash the checks, but they're there.
So you could have them in the archive, I guess.
Right, but I don't think that sort of information should be shared.
Oh, I agree. But, back then, $1 back then was the equivalent of 50 grand today. Don't you love it when people say stuff like that? It's like, well, you're going a little overboard. Right.
We had to walk up and down a hill both ways in the snow. Yay. Pick a coal up between the tracks.
Any Cosby reference, I'm on. And what I'm hoping, do you think Paul's going to take part in some way in this first episode? Or okay,
I would like him to. If we take a long time, then probably.
Well, I'm hoping we're going to hear a lot from Paul Thacker.
Paul Thacker, he will definitely join us at least for if he can't make it into this 0 episode, he will be in for the first one. He's a good guy. He has helped me, more than helped me. He is in control of archiving tapes. That is his department. After I wasn't really updating the site too much anymore, and I actually had even pulled away from it, in about 2006, Paul Thacker came forward and he introduced himself to me through an email. And he said he would like to help with archiving tapes. And he really, really has. And he's the leader in that department. He has contacted people to make archiving programs possible. He has followed up with people with large collections. He has archived them. Not all of it's available on the website yet, but it has been done. They're truly archived. And what's neat about Paul is he has tapes that were available between users. And if you're familiar with growing up with these old systems, you might have had a home computer like an Atari 800 or a Commodore 64, and maybe you had some tapes that you recorded to or discs, and you would write game number 1, and then that was the name of the program, even if the program was a type-in from a Compute magazine or an Antic magazine.
Oh, you would save it as game number 1,
right.
You mean.
So this is how these tapes work. People would write one program on it, maybe even give it a clueless name that meant nothing to either Paul or I. Paul would record the whole side. Paul would go through and say, what's on here? Paul would find a program. Paul would find 6 different versions of that program. Paul would find programs that had been halfway recorded over. Paul made sure to archive all of that separately and as efficiently as possible and document it. So something I want to cover, there are so many topics. I should back up here and I should say that there are a lot of topics available to anyone who is starting a podcast. Something that has to be zeroed in on, and that's not supposed to be a pun on the 0 episode, is that you have to choose. You have to narrow, you have to focus. I am no good at that. I'm not good at that. I can't do it.
How many fingers?
Chris is holding up a finger, and I'm supposed to see one, and I'm hoping that's what he was doing. So they're not giving me the finger. So I would like to cover the ancestry of the Bally Arcade. Something that came up in about 2001, perhaps 2002, is someone named Tony Miller, who was responsible for working on the Bally Arcade when it was created, mentioned that the Bally Arcade's chipset is actually a direct descendant of Space Invaders arcade games, the CPU for Gunfight, or something to that effect. I didn't understand it then. I might be able to understand it better if I can find those exact posts, which are definitely archived. Now, Gunfight used the Intel 8080 CPU, which is why the Astrocade uses the Z80, because it's compatible, sort of. The Z80 can run 8080 code, but not the other way around. As you can see, my knowledge of all of this is completely limited, and what I just told you is pretty much what I know. There is obviously a story there. If I could find people to interview, if I can dig into this, there is a good story there, and I would like to discover it and present it.
Yeah, because that would mean Taito took some technical influence from Midway, because it was Midway that added a CPU at all to Gunfight, right? So that's pretty interesting.
We'll find out, Chris.
Yeah. So I've already talked about writing new games as the next logical step once one has a lot of information about any game system or any computer or anything like that. So are we going to encourage activity in the homebrew Astrocade scene? Because there is a latent one there. I mean, you should definitely cover the 2 released games that we've already talked about, War and Crazy Climber, because those were pretty big deals. I mean, the first new Astrocade game since what, 1985 ish? I mean,
it depends. It depends on how you look at it. There was actually some people in the community who were just sending cartridges back and forth to each other who were sharing code in the 80s. They're not considered released cartridges. Something that's available to the public, yes.
Because, I mean, in terms of talking about homebrew programming, you can also talk about people who just play around with the system or even interview them. What do you find interesting about the...
Yeah, I would like to do interviews with people who actually have a lot of experience with the system and maybe grew up with it, which I did not do, which I didn't learn about it until the 90s. And now, about homebrew programming, I believe, and I would love to make you guys believe, that homebrew programming did not start in the 90s. I would like to let you know that homebrew programming has been around since 1975 in my eyes. And earlier, the very, very first PCs, and by that I mean personal computers, not IBM personal computers, all right? These systems were programmed in people's living rooms, in people's kitchens. If that is not homebrew programming, I don't know what is.
Right.
These people were learning for the sake of learning. They were playing for the sake of the experience of touching the hardware, learning the software. They weren't doing this for work. They were doing this for pleasure. This is the same exact reason people were homebrewing games today. And they were doing this back then. An insight that you get to see very clearly is in the Arcadian newsletters and in the Cursor newsletters as well, is people want to teach other people. They are about sharing. They are about, hey, I wrote this. This is great. You guys should type it in and try it out. And if you find out anything about it, let me know what you think. If you can add something to it, if you can cut off 6 bytes and add a sound effect, please do that. Because there's no sound, These people wanted to help each other, and through that, it is available in archives, and we can look at this and learn today. And I would like to have that happen so that people of today, people who have the knowledge, have modern computers that can cross-compile and create new games, that'd be neat to me.
Yeah.
It has been neat when 2 have been released already. But even if new games don't get created, what about mess? Let's make that better.
Before we go any further, I think you should, quote, share your email address so that you get feedback.
My name is Adam, and you can reach me at ballyalley@hotmail.com.
You can private message me on Atari Age. I'm Chris++.
Now, we expect to get loads of email. We're going to be clogged, and we're going to have the first episode be nothing but reader feedback.
I'm telling you, we really got a good thing going, so you better hang on to yourself. That's a Bowie quote. Well, before we wrap this up, let's cover the obvious thing. How did you get so involved in the Bally Arcade / Astrocade?
When I first began collecting some of these older consoles and home computers, I never stopped playing them. But when they started becoming available for a quarter, I said, why don't I just buy each one of them? And I had a very large collection for a while until I finally gave some of it to Chris, got rid of most of it, and I am glad I did, because now I play the games I own, and what I don't play, I get to eventually. In about 1994 or 93, I read about this system in one of the books I had that was from the early 80s that covered the Z-Grass, actually. And it was the system, I was like, I want to get a Z-Grass, that'd be neat. And I don't have one, but I did find out that it was related to the Bally Arcade, and from there I wanted one. And I found my first one for a quarter, and I picked it up at a flea market. Oh. And it came with a few games. In fact, I saw the games first, and I was like, how much you want for these? And each game was a quarter. I think there was 4 or 5 of them. And then I saw the system, but I didn't have that much money with me. I had like $1 left or something. That already bought some other things. And I was talking to a friend I'd gone with, and He said, why don't you go back there and offer him your $1 for it? And I went back and I said, how much do you want for the game, the system? And he goes, $0.25.
Wow.
So I still had change to go buy another 2600 and then television. No, but I didn't find anything else that day.
Those were the days before you people let eBay ruin that part of the hobby.
So I did know that there is an Arcadian newsletter, but I was a member of an Atari 8-bit user group here in town, and it so happened I was bringing it up, talking with someone there, and they said, oh, I've heard of that. And I'm like, oh, you've heard of the Bally? And they said, oh, sure, you should talk to Mr. Hauser, who was the president of the Atari Club. And they said, I think he wrote some games for it. And I said, that sounds interesting. So I approached him, and it was very close. By 1994, there was very few users left in the Atari 8-bit group. And who was left, we all knew each other very well, or as well as we could. Even some of us only knew each other from meetings. And we started talking, and he told me that he'd been involved with the Arcadian, and he had published tapes, and he had something called the catalog, which I now know was the way that most people ordered tapes, but back then I didn't. And he kept track of all this, and he still had all of his things, and he invited me over one Sunday afternoon, and he showed me what he owned, which was pretty much everything for the Astrocade that was released. And we went through it one Sunday afternoon, and his son, who was in his early 20s, shared his memories of the machine, and I fell in love. I thought, wow, this system is great. And while I was there, Mr. Hauser, his name was Richard Hauser, he said, hey, you know what, we should call it Bob. And I said, Bob who? He was like, oh, he was the person who used to publish the Arcadian. And I said, really? And he's like, yeah, let's call him. I was like, so he called up Bob, and they chatted a bit for a while, and he told him who I was. I didn't talk to Bob, but he was available back then, and I thought that was great. So I wrote Bob a letter, and I said, would it be okay if I get some of your information? And later on, in the late 90s, he gave me permission to do that. At the time, I just said, hey, here I am. And what's really neat is I started sending him an Orphan Computers and Game System, which was a newsletter I did in the early 90s. And after 3 issues, Chris here joined me on board. And I sent them to him. And when I bought the Bally collection from him, those issues that I sent to him were brought back to me, which was like this huge circle, because it came through several people in order to come back. And I found that really neat.
Yeah.
And eventually, with Chris, we discovered the system together. We played around with it. And what was it, about 2001, I started BallyAlley.com. And it doesn't look great now, and it looked worse then. So now here I am having a podcast. And how about you, Chris?
I never stopped playing all the way through either,
And why should have we?
Well, yeah, I kept playing the old games through the period when they started to be called classic and retro, and this happened like some point in the mid-90s.
During that huge crash during the 80s that none of us saw.
Yeah, that none of us knew about except for the great prices, which I attributed to overstock,
I didn't even think about it.
But, they weren't all cheaper. Even into 83, 84, I remember spending $30-odd on Pitfall 2, Lost Caverns, for the 2600.
Right, I got that for my birthday because it was $30, and I didn't have $30. I was a kid.
Right, because, that was about $2 million in today's money.
And also, for us, I think, we went on to computers, like many people our age at the time, and so we sort of distanced ourselves. So the prices for computer stock stayed about the same as they had for Atari cartridges and things like that.
That's a good point, yeah. I'm coming across Classic after I hadn't really stopped playing my favorites and discovering new favorites, thanks to the advent of thrift shops and, video games at Goodwill and stuff. I'd read that and say, oh, they're Classic now. All right, if you say so. I thought that was really funny. So by the late 90s, I thought I was the only person on Earth, not literally, but pretty close, who was still playing these old video games, because all I had when we started hanging out again, Adam, was an Atari 2600 and a Commodore 64. That was all I wanted. I didn't want to know about anything else. I didn't want to know about this new CD-ROM with the multimedia.
So let's put, this time period would have been...
This is 1997, and by this point I had been writing my own articles and essays for my own amusement, saving them on sequential files on 1541 floppies using the Commodore 64. I wrote a file writer and reader program, And I thought I was the only one doing nerdy stuff like this, but I had fun doing it, and I was still playing all the old games, picking them up for $1 or less while making my rounds at the thrift shops and at Goodwills and everything like that. And so I was in a subsidiary of Goodwill that was attached to the largest Goodwill store in Albuquerque. And I ran into a buddy of mine from 10 years previous. He and I had been freshmen in high school. And then I went to another high school and lost touch with all my friends. And this guy's name, if you can believe this goofy name, was Adam Triunfo. The store had an even goofier name, the You Fix It Corral. But then it changed into Clearance Corner.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. But yeah, Adam was working there. And so I'm going through a box of something from the 80s. And he came over, "Are you Chris?" I said, "Yeah." "Adam?" He and I, sort of shook hands and said, "Well, that's cool. You're working at Goodwill." "Yep." And then I left and I never saw him again. No, he gave me a copy of a newsletter.
Till today.
Till today. Yes, that's why it really sounds improvised here. He gave me a newsletter he had written about old video games. And they weren't even all that old yet at the time. Because he started Orphan Computers and Game Systems, on paper, kids, in 1994. I asked him, "So you write about video games too?" He said, "Yeah." And we started hanging out, playing games a lot, and I didn't know anybody else at the time who liked to play Atari 2600 and Commodore 64 games. He eventually nudged me to the internet, or dragged me kicking and screaming, because when I encouraged him to start up his newsletter again, he said he would if I'd collaborate, and we did that for a couple of years, sent out a lot of paper issues, had a ball writing it, going to World of Atari 98, and then CGE 2003, and using interviews that we had conducted at those to feed the material for the newsletter. And in 1999 it became a website, and we've actually been pretty good about adding recent articles, which is
recently, yes,
good for us.
Yeah.
And I don't know what any of this has to do with what you asked me. In 1982, we took a trip back east to Buffalo to visit family. My mom's sister's best friend had a son named Robert, who was a couple years older than me. So I was 10, he was probably 12 or 13. And he was the kid who first showed me adventure. And so, summertime of 82,
Never
I
heard of
first
it.
got my mind blown by it. And this same guy, Robert, took me into his basement to show me his Atari computer, I believe. And he said not to touch it because he had a program in memory. He was typing in a program, and he had a magazine open, and that's all I remember. And I wish I had, focused on the model number or which magazine it was, but it looked like all this gobbledygook on the screen. I was absolutely captivated because who didn't want to make his own video games? I'd been playing Atari VCS games since February of 82. And it became an obsession with me, on par with music, believe it or not. And he said not to touch it because he hadn't saved it yet. And I said, "Well, how do you save it?" You know what I mean? I didn't ask him any smart-ass questions. Okay, are you going to take a picture of the screen? He said, "Well, I save them on these." And he showed me just a normal blank cassette, like you would listen to music on. And that just entranced me, like all these innocent-looking music cassettes hiding video games on them. I was just, I learned how to program in BASIC that summer from a book checked out from the library. I mean, I just really got interested in talking to this new thing, this home computer, the microcomputer, as it was called, quite often, the micro, to separate them from mainframes, because, a lot of our friends had mainframes in their bedroom.
Right.
And then he brought me over and showed me one more thing before we had to go, and this was the Bally Professional Arcade. And I thought it was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen. We played The Incredible Wizard, and he let me play for a little while, and I said, "This is just like Wizard of War." He said, "Yeah, it is." And I can't remember if he had an explanation or had read an explanation why the name was changed. But that was my only experience with the Astrocade. I loved the controller. To this day, it's one of my favorite controllers. I love the trigger thing, and I love the combination of a joystick and a paddle in one knob, on top of it and stuff. And so I didn't see another Astrocade until I started hanging out with you again in 97. And, it figures you were able to collect all that amazing stuff because you worked at Goodwill. And
I didn't use that to my advantage. I
sure
wasn't
you
allowed
didn't.
to do that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you didn't steal it, but I mean, come
No.
on. You probably made note of
There was
what
actually
came in.
a rule that I had to follow. When anything came in, it had to sit on the shelves for 24 hours before it could be purchased by an employee. That didn't mean we had to show everyone where it was, but it had to be out. And that was true. It was out.
Okay.
That didn't mean we said, because there were people who came in every single day, just like I used to like to go around to, and it would be on the shelf, but that didn't mean it was right on the front shelf saying, "Buy me, please, Atari Game Collector." It was in the store somewhere.
You put it in the bag near the electric pencil sharpeners.
I didn't hide it either. I didn't want to get in trouble.
No, I know. But, I mean, this guy, Adam, had an original Odyssey with all the layovers, with all the airplane stops. No, with all the overlays, which is pretty amazing. I mean, you had an Odyssey with the original 1972 Magnavox console and everything else. You know, and in television, he had an Odyssey 2 with boxed Quest for the Rings. And
I had 43 different systems, which I'm so glad I don't have that anymore.
That is a lot for an apartment.
So now I have a few left.
Yeah, well, yes. And yes, folks, he does have an Astrocade.
I do.
He does have all the original cartridge games for it. I think you got all of them.
I eventually had them, but now I have a multi-car. I got rid of most of them. Okay. I feel I kept some of my favorites. I kept my prototypes,
which is cool. And obviously, you have War and Crazy Climber,
right?
The Incredible Wizard.
I think number 2s because the programmer got number 1s.
Right, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. But cool. Honestly, I don't care about the numbers on it. They were hand numbers because collectors seem to like that. Personally, since I did the numbering, I found it annoying.
Well, there were 50 sold?
There were 50 each, yeah. There was a run of 20 for War because we didn't have any cartridge shells. Then we got more, and we did a second run. And a run of Crazy Climber was always 50. It just was released at once.
You have number 2. That's a collector's item if anybody knew what it was.
I should have gotten number 0. Think of this. This episode is a collector's item already.
So you taught me a great deal about the Astrocade and how it worked. And, you've told me some things that I just find so cool. Like you had to use the screen for code because part of your available RAM was a screen RAM, right? And still is.
Under BASIC. That's correct.
And that's how I became even more interested in the Bally Arcade / Astrocade.
So we are about finished wrapping things up here. Just for the last few things to say, we are going to have an episode every 2 weeks or so. So that would be bi-monthly. I hope you guys, if you have any ideas that you want to come up with, and send in some feedback. And if we get no feedback by the first one, that's okay because we expect a couple of people to listen to this.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for inviting me along, Adam.
Good to have you.